Right, this is going to be take 2 of our Chapter 5 slideshow lecture caused by technical difficulties last time. The case study again was our plant from the eastern part of the world, dung of the devil. Its relevance being that it was used during the time of the Spanish flu, which claimed, as you can see, anywhere between, depending on the estimate, 20 and 100 million different people. Now, it was an H1N1 variant, just like swine flu when we dealt with the swine flu epidemic in 2009. And it was shown during the time of Spanish flu to have antiviral properties. Someone managed to figure out that when giving it to these people who were suffering from this virus, this disease, that it helped to fight back against the virus. So when the time of the swine flu epidemic came about, it was revisited and in some cases showed more efficacy, or basically was more effective than some of the antiviral vaccines and medicines that were around at the time. So why are we talking about a plant called the dung of the devil, and why is it relevant? Well, as of today, plant life, only about 3% of plants have been tested for medical uses, for any kind of healing properties or any kind of medical properties. It's only 3% of the potentially thousands and thousands and thousands of species of plants on this planet. That to say that only 3% have been tested, we don't even know what that means. That there's a lot of unexplored territory in terms of just usefulness to people. And if biodiversity continues to shrink the way that it's going, which we'll get back to towards the end of this and in chapter 18, our next unit of study, we might be losing potentially valuable properties from if we continue to lose species of plants or animals to that extent as well that we're just unaware of right now. So when we talk about biodiversity, we mentioned at the beginning of the year as it being, biodiversity being kind of an indicator in terms of the health of the planet. The more diversity, the better, because the more stable and the easier an ecosystem could bounce back, or in our terms, the planet can bounce back from disturbances. We do look at diversity at various levels. Ecosystem diversity is just the different ecosystems in a region, species diversity being different species, and genetic diversity being different genes. For our purposes, we're really going to focus on species diversity more than anything. Genetic diversity coming in terms of leading to speciation, but we're, from the environmental side, really going to focus on species diversity to be that middle one here. How many different species of plants and animals and decomposers do we have in an ecosystem? So, two measures of biodiversity are species richness and evenness. We saw this with our lab on the Shannon-Wiener index. Species richness just being the number of species in the area, and evenness being a measure of how dominated the number of individuals is by one species, meaning how well represented is one species compared to the other ones, based on the number of individuals that are there. So if you look at species community 1 and 2 down here of all these different plant species and tree species, you see community 1 is very evenly distributed. It has very good very high species evenness, because if we were to randomly sample one of those, there's a 25% chance of it being A, B, C, or D of those tree species. Community 2 has a very low evenness, because again, 70% is A, so one random sampling here, 70% chance of picking a species, picking an individual from species A. Why this is important is in terms of ecosystem and community health. If a tree fungus or if a virus or some kind of disease, I should say a disease was to affect, let's say, species A, here 75% of the producer population of those trees is still viable to support that ecosystem. But here we'd be down to 30%, and that would be bad. We really don't want that to happen, because this is not very even, it would be more difficult to bounce back from a big disturbance. So when measuring the health of ecosystems, one of the things we do look for is what does the species evenness look like? So what causes biodiversity and leads to it? Well, the simple answer is evolution. Now, that evolution could be individual mutations, what we'll call microevolution, or it could be what we're more familiar with, which are adaptations leading to the formation of new species and reproductive isolation. That's what we call macroevolution. So the quick genetics review, which you can skip over as if you feel you need to, but we know what genes are. These are where the codes are for different characteristics. We know that we represent them usually with genotypes. So we know we use capital letters, lowercase letters, primes, double primes, and things like that to represent different genotypes. So genes are expressed and they lead to phenotypes, which are the actual set of traits. So the genotype might be big A, or those two same genes, or little a, those two same different genes, but they could code for a different phenotype, actual characteristics, different fur colors. We could have mixing of furs. We could have dominant versus recessive codominance. We know that there are different ways that those genes can be expressed as various phenotypes. The phenotypes are really important here because the phenotypes are determine what helps that organism to survive better, whether it's more advantageous or less. And if it's more advantageous, then those genes, that genotype that coded for that phenotype, is what gets passed on to the next generation. So looking at evolution, we always know, we know that natural selection is our mechanism for evolution, for making these changes happen from generation to generation. We always have to differentiate between natural and artificial. So when you hear artificial selection, we're talking about humans selecting specific traits, and breeding basically is artificial selection. So think dogs, think crops. Natural selection is the natural mechanism where the environmental pressures and the environment around these organisms is what determines what individuals not breed but reproduce and pass on their genes. So when we talk about dog breeds, even though they are species, we do not consider them naturally selected species. And this is my dog as an example. The Cocker Spaniel is one species of dog that is bred for particular traits. Its original or its origins come back to being a field dog, a hunting dog. And it has characteristics that help for that. It's got large ears that help with its hearing. It's got very good smell receptors that help. It's quick. He's fast. He's got, his legs are proportionally sized for his body that allow him to hunt fast. His ears are actually able to kick up things in the dirt when they drag in the ground, which allows him to smell better and to stay on scents better. So he has a lot of characteristics that nature and environmental pressures didn't select for, but that people did instead. Now, natural selection is what Darwin observed, and a quick review of what Darwin saw and how it relates to us is that individuals differ in traits, and those traits can be passed on from parents to offspring. What determines that is the environmental side of it. It's the environmental pressures that lead to whatever traits allow that parent to survive and pass on the genes to that offspring. Now, why we care about it? Well, when we start changing habitats and we start looking at human interferences and changing climates and pollution affecting habitats, the individuals that are able to deal with those environmental pressures being caused by people are going to be the ones that survive and pass on their genes. Likewise, if no organisms are able to survive, well, then we start looking at a loss of biodiversity and we start talking about extinctions, which is going to be in chapter 18. The example given here is these amphipods, which are these little fish, shrimp-looking organisms, I should say. A trait that's valuable or that's useful for them is actually being small in size. And the reason that that's valuable is because the larger offspring are more easily seen and then more easily eaten. The smaller ones are able to avoid fish, hide better, and avoid predators. Well, the first generation of parents are both large in body size, which is a dominant trait. So if you remember, so what we ended up with here in our next generation was 2 or 3 large ones and 1 small body type. Well, let's say 1 large and 1 small survive and they pass on those genes. You get 1 with a large body type and then 3 with a small body type. The large one gets eaten, and then eventually the trait that is seen in generations to come is the one for smaller body types. And that's basically evolution by natural selection simplified and summed up here. Now, evolution can also occur by random processes, which are all in the next slide. We'll go over these more in class, but things like mutations can cause a complete change in genetic composition or new traits, which could be more advantageous. Doesn't have to necessarily, could introduce a new trait into a population, which could lead to a new species. Genetic drift is basically when over time the composition changes as a result of random mating. You start to lose maybe recessive traits. They start to be seen less and less, and then eventually, even though the recessive trait might not be less beneficial, but just random mating gets it out of the population and over the course of time. Bottlenecking we tend to see with populations that are currently endangered or threatened because their population sizes are reduced so much that the offspring are coming from a specific gene pool, a smaller gene pool. You see a lot of inbreeding with bottlenecking, and it's not very good for a lot of populations. Some can inbreed, there are certain species and certain animal types that can inbreed with no problems. But as you start to get with more and more complex animals, mammals especially, inbreeding causes a large problem in terms of health. It's not good for genetic pools because, again, if you have just a population that are all very similar genetically, that don't have genetic variation, again, a disturbance, just like it would with low species evenness, if you have low genetic evenness, then you're going to end up with a disturbance or a disease or something causing a lot of problems for that population, which could lead to a very difficult time bouncing back for population numbers. Founder effect is basically when a population colonizes and grows massively from a small number of individuals starting. We see this with certain organisms that are protected, that are basically moved and placed in certain areas. The founder effect is very possible, where what you end up with is not necessarily having a large population bottleneck down into a large gene pool, I should say, bottlenecking into a smaller one, which is just leads to, again, population numbers with one similar gene pool. Here we're basically saying we have a founder, group of individuals that basically are responsible for the gene pool of an entire upcoming population. This happens when certain organisms are whittled down in terms of population numbers to a small number of individuals, and then those populations bounce back again because those new offspring have the same genes as the few individuals that they originated from. And again, this is we'll go over this a little bit more in class. I wouldn't focus on writing all of this stuff down. It is in the textbook, so you can always reference it in the textbook as well. But I would definitely know these terms, and they are definitely very important. So speciation and extinction determine biodiversity. Speciation occurs a couple of different ways. The difference between allopatric and sympatric speciation, which is coming up, is basically, are they physically near each other or are they not? Allopatric speciation occurs when organisms are not physically near each other. So when new species are created by either geographic or reproductive isolation, when they're physically not able to reproduce for whatever reason. Sympatric speciation is basically the absence of geographic isolation, when organisms are near each other and they can reproduce, but something causes them to not reproduce, some change that occurs. We won't focus on sympatric speciation too much in terms of polyploidy and losing different numbers of chromosomes like with the wheat here. Most evolution we're going to see is due to geographic isolation or reproductive isolation. Now, the pace of evolution we'll cover a little bit more in class, but basically, the rate that evolution occurs, whether or not a species can adapt to change or not, it has a lot of different factors. We'll cover these a little bit more in depth in class. But basically, a slowly changing environment gives species more time to adapt, so we can see that relationship here. If you have less genetic variation, there's less chance for the species to adapt to changing conditions, because again, less genetic variation in a population means it's going to be harder for these organisms to react to any changing conditions because the genes that would help the traits aren't physically there in that gene pool. If a good mutation occurs, it will spread more rapidly in a small population than in a larger population. So population sizes that are smaller can adapt faster based on a good mutation. And this is a big one, shorter generation time, especially when it comes to studying evolution. Shorter generation time has really helped us understand evolution a little better, because the shorter the generation time, the easier it is for species to adapt, and therefore for us to observe and see that happen. So one of these driving forces behind evolution is basically, the ability for an organism to take over a role in an ecosystem, what we would call a niche, ideal conditions for a species. If a species finds its niche, a fundamental niche, these ideal conditions, so we're talking abiotic and biotic factors, all considered, an organism that finds its fundamental niche will basically be able to survive, grow, reproduce, and hold that area, hold that spot in that role in that ecosystem for a long period of time, pretty much uncontested. The organisms that have difficulty finding this niche have to basically find a new one. So that could be, habitat, shelter. It could be shelter. It could be food. It could be conditions ranging from, salinity in the ocean, air quality, concentrations in soil, if we're talking about plants, of different nutrients. So there's a lot of factors that go into determining this, and organisms compete for these roles. The organisms that find their fundamental niche are able to survive, grow, and reproduce. As we get outside or further away from that fundamental niche, it becomes more and more difficult to reproduce, and then for some organisms, more and more difficult just to survive. Now, some organisms are considered generalists, some are considered specialists. The generalists obviously can tolerate a wider range of conditions. When we start talking about invasive species, we're going to see that a lot of invasive species would be considered generalists because they can tolerate a lot of conditions, and once they find the ideal ones, they're able to grow very, very specifically. They're able to grow very, very well and survive really well in that new niche. The specialists live only in specific habitats. They can't tolerate as wide of a range of conditions. So we see our bug here on the left is an example of a species generalist, can survive on a lot of different foods. The beetle here is a specialist. It only eats this one certain type of leaf. Outside of this habitat, it will not do well. However, our moth-looking bug on the left here is it considered a generalist, meaning that, let's say it is pushed out or loses one food source, it can bounce back by finding other food sources to eat. So evolution leads to speciation, the growth of these species. Well, what causes species to go away? Biodiversity to decrease. Because we talked about biodiversity health being a measure of overall health, or biodiversity numbers being a measure of overall health of an ecosystem and then a planet. Well, when species numbers go down and we lose biodiversity, we call those mass extinctions. When large numbers of species go extinct over a relatively short period of time. And you can see by this, the reason we're bringing this up is because our next unit on biodiversity is going to cover extinction and endangerment a little bit more. We see that these arrows all indicate the five previous global mass extinctions. This one here at about 65 million years ago, you're all familiar with. This is the dinosaurs, where the dinosaurs were wiped off the planet by the meteorite. The largest one was actually this one here that occurred about 250 million years ago. And just in terms of sheer number, this one, the cause is still unknown, but we know that these have occurred from looking at the fossil record. Now, why we bring up extinction as well, since this is environmental science and we study human impacts, scientists themselves feel that we're currently in the middle of our 6th mass extinction. Estimates are that at any point in the next, few years to decades, that we could lose, because of human activity, anywhere from 2 to 25% of all species on the planet, and these are being caused by things like climate change affecting habitats, pollution, losses to air quality, water quality, and things of that nature. Could all potentially lead to a massive loss of species, what is being coined the 6th mass extinction. So that's our lecture on Chapter 5. Next week, we'll cover Chapter 18, which goes into biodiversity a little bit more, talks about extinction, endangerment, threatened species, as well as invasive species, and how they affect biodiversities of an area as well. Hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you all in class.